So today, we're going to tackle some hard questions about what was the third sermon that John Claypool preached. And next week, we will close out this kind of series as we come up to Labor Day the following week. So as I have the past 2 weeks, I want to set the context. You will remember that the first sermon came after Laura Lou had been diagnosed with leukemia and then had gone into remission. The second happened after she had relapsed and then gone into her second remission. That brings us to this place. He wrote, "The second medicine wasn't as effective as the first, but for a shorter time span. In August, at the end of our family vacation, several things began to happen, and we were never able to maintain another period of remission, although at least 4 other medicines were tried. Laura Lou attended school only a few scattered days that fall. Our life revolved around intermittent periods of hospitalization and unnumbered trips to the outpatient clinic and emergency room of Children's Hospital. Toward the end, the treatments became almost impossible and created the added strain of trying to decide what to continue and what to forego. We had a memorable Christmas day, which Laura Lou anticipated greatly, planned for carefully. But when that was over, her life processes began to wane. Just 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, with the snow falling softly outside the window, Laura Lou died in her own bed and her own room." Which brings us to the text. This story of Abraham has intrigued me forever. It has been deconstructed hundreds of times by different scholars and preachers, trying to take away the offensive nature of the story. We always feel as pastors that we need to make the Bible somehow palpable, whatever it is, for so-called modern people. How could someone consider sacrificing her or his son or daughter? That's the question. I have colleagues who have taken an oath that never again will they even have this passage read in church. And one this past week in the lectionary group, retired, said that about halfway through his ministry, he swore to himself that he would never address the text again in worship. Such strong reactions people have to the text. How can one consider sacrificing one's child? My response is, sadly, that I've seen modern and postmodern people sacrifice their children to much lesser gods in different ways, with very little thought given to the whole thing. Gods like the pursuit of wealth, power, business careers, and social climbing. Little gods that come to play in value systems that have been inculcated into families for ages. So with no regard often for the families, the children are left to raise themselves, to figure out the values and the values they have learned by watching their parents. Theologians have written this off as a text of terror, a remnant of a time when people literally offered human sacrifice to God. And by the way, from the date in which the origin of this story and through the centuries following, many societies continued to practice human sacrifice. These conversations may make us feel better somehow, but they also give us permission not to struggle with the hermeneutic, the meaning of the story, why it's there, and what it means for people who encountered it in today's age. We read the story and we hear God say to Abraham, take your son Isaac. Remember, a son that was the miracle child, because as the storytellers already told us, Sarah has ceased the menstruation process. Abraham says, I'm too old. And yet strangers have announced that a promised child is on the way. So now the promised child, the one who ought not to have been, Abraham's being told by God to take the child and make the sacrifice. Take the one you love and go. And just as God had said to Abraham in the beginning of the Abraham stories, get up and go to a land that I would show you, Abraham takes Isaac, a couple of servants, and they set out on foot, heading to the mountain, Abraham prepared to make the sacrifice. He and Isaac keep walking, even though Isaac's asking the troubling questions. Abraham keeps hoping that God will provide a solution to a very difficult problem. When John Claypool preached about his experience of his daughter's death, he addressed this story. And again, I was blessed to have an opportunity to have some conversations with him about it later. Because as I said, being fascinated with the story, everybody was asking all kinds of questions. But I wanted to talk about how this text had spoken to him in an existential way. He said the story of Abraham kept running through his mind throughout the months of Laura Lou's sickness. 18 months they journeyed together. But her illness was serious, and he kept hoping. He kept thinking, well, Abraham didn't have to go down the mountain alone. Surely God won't make me go down the mountain alone. Surely God will provide some kind of answer, even though some other part of him feared that such was not the case. The struggle. Abraham's heart must have burst with joy. And I'm sure if we could have been there to hear the storyteller tell this story, because it was part of the oral tradition, I'm sure that we would have caught the spirit, the smiles, the glee over the fact that a ram was caught in the bush. That God held back Abraham, and the promised child was spared, and they journeyed down the mountain. On the other hand, John Claypool and his family found that their hearts were burst with the pain because a ram was not in the thicket. The sacrifice did come. After the fact, he looked back on what avenues could be taken to move forward. How do you even begin to move forward in situations like that? I got to say, I got talked into, and I promised myself I'd never get talked into it again. I got talked into running a support group in Delaware for parents who had lost children. And it was wide open. They could have lost an adult child. They could have lost a young child. There were cases, the hardest cases, where late-term pregnancies were lost. All those expectations and excitement. Those couples struggle the hardest. And I can tell you, when that evening was over and I got home, I could barely walk in the door. The harshness, the pain that flowed from these people as they shared with each other, loved each other, supported each other. And I did that twice, and then when I was asked to do it a third time, I said, no, I just emotionally couldn't do that. So I can't imagine what it would be like to find that way, that place of trying to move forward. So Claypool said that three opportunities or three openings were before him, and he found two completely unacceptable, and I understand why. The first one he called the road of unquestioning resignation. Now, some of you here, some of you grew up in church traditions where you had the opportunity to question, were encouraged to question, to seek, right? Some of us grew up in religious systems where questioning was not a good thing. You didn't doubt, you didn't question, and if you walked through hard places, you might open your mouth to ask for a prayer request, but as my older daughter will say to people when she talks about growing up, she says, well, all I know is remember my dad saying, suck it up. I said it lovingly, by the way. And that's kind of how we were taught in religious systems. Oh, suck it up. God's will is being done and you don't have a right to complain. A lot of people have trouble. You don't get to ask those questions of God. And I would say to that, it's a denial of basic biblical religion. You remember Job sitting out there on the dung heap, and the so-called comforters came to be helpful. And he struggled with what was going on. And his wife is saying, well, why don't you just go ahead and curse God and die? Battered from every side, having lost his children, lost everything he had, his body sores everywhere, struggling, always struggling, and engaged in conversations with these so-called comforters who were saying, you must have done something. Remember 2 weeks ago we talked about Deuteronomic theology? If you're bad, God will get you. If you're good, God will bless you. A theology Jesus refuted. You must have done something, Job, as he sits there struggling, trying to find a way forward, asking the questions of how this could have happened to him. What about Jesus out there in the garden, praying, asking, begging God to let the cup pass from him, the cup of suffering that we know as the cross? And then there's Abraham himself, that later God's getting ready to destroy a whole city, and Abraham's bargaining with God, and apparently God's up for the bargaining. Well, if I can only find X number of people who are righteous there, then will you withhold your hand? Well, if I can only find this many, and it goes on, as if it's not fixed, as if it is not something that's locked down, nailed down. This sense of being open and questioning and struggling is a part of the biblical narrative. So when people say, you don't have a right to question, they haven't quite read the whole Bible, or they haven't paid attention to the Bible that they've read. The Bible is this living text about this complex God. You've heard me mention before that another one of my spiritual heroes, a guy named Carlisle Marney, he was something else, but that's a whole nother story. He pastored Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, which is probably the most progressive church in the city at that time. Marnie wrote Claypool a letter, and he said several things. And he talked about the context. And then he said he admitted to having no words for the suffering of the innocent. But he wrote this line: I fall back on the idea that God has a lot to give account for. When that was shared, people were up in arms. They were so mad. How could he say that God would have a lot to give account for? But what Claypool heard and what Marnie was saying is that God is not so past the point of understanding human pain. God is not so remote that God doesn't understand what we feel, the questions we ask, and that God is not so far beyond us that someday we won't have insights, because now we may know in part. But as Paul would say later in that wonderful hymn he picked up and shipped into the Corinthian church, then we shall know. We have to trust that somewhere along the line in our struggles, God is open to hearing our question. God, who gives us incredible freedom, this wonderful parent behind all of existence, this God is willing to hear us and to walk with us and to allow us to ask those questions, to express our pain. I wrote on the Facebook page belatedly today because I forgot to do it yesterday. I don't think, in my mind, that this God wants us to just accept things in some unresigned, unquestioning way. That God would ask us to force that down our throat any more than God would expect me to force down broccoli without spitting it up. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to tell you what I thought about broccoli. What good is a relationship with a loving parent if the loving parent shuts the door on the conversation, shuts the door to human pain and wondering? The other road that seemed to be a waste of energy, that's my terminology, is the road to come to some intellectual understanding. This is a dead end as well. I've pastored people through the ages, and they kept telling me, "Oh, I'm okay. I'm okay." And oftentimes I wondered what they were really feeling. They were working things out in their head. They were trying to come to some logical pathway to understanding. But I could tell in conversations and drinking coffee, just watching the body language, that the pain was seeping out everywhere. But their way of coping was simply to try to come to an intellectual understanding of how or why this can happen. This is our trying to tie up all the loose ends, to make a bad situation right. Claypool said that when Laura Lou was in agony late in the disease, that she would be crying out and would ask him to pray to God to take the pain away as she bit down on a towel. And he would pray. And then he would have to say to her, "I am praying." You ever been in that place where you're so caught up in pain for your child, and there's nothing you can do to make it right? There's no intellectual path, there's no understanding, there's nothing but just trying to be there and hold and support your child. I remember Anna had surgery on both of her legs, and the doctor was really good and nice and all that. He didn't mention one thing, and that is for 2 days after the surgery, her legs would be seizing for about 48 hours. So that night at the hospital, I said to Chris, You got to work tomorrow. Go on home. I got this covered. No problem. Didn't have a lot of nurses at the hospital. I remember walking the floor as her legs seized and she cried out and there was no more medicine to give. And I just wanted the night to be over. I wanted the 48 hours to pass. I wanted the suffering for her over. And so he struggled with that, but he realized in the midst of the struggle that there's no way to intellectually deal with this. When we attempt to absolutize life, to work it all out, to think we've got all the answers, we miss so much of what's there to experience. Sometimes we have to walk through the journey. It can't be explained. It can't be worked out. We just walk forward and do the best we possibly can. It's hard to face the truth. Richard Rohr has written a lot about this, and the spiritual enrichment folk are getting ready to tackle one of his books in September. By the way, you may want to consider that. He's fascinating. It's hard for me to accept the point that he writes so eloquently about, that evil and good can exist at the same time in the world. And they can exist in me at the same time in the world. That's how things are for all of us, light and darkness in the same place. After all, didn't the Gospel of John say about Jesus is coming, that the light comes and it shines in the darkness and the darkness has never put it out, but it doesn't say that the light makes the darkness go away, does it? Things exist in the world we can't explain. We just can't. Need to wrap this up. Finally, we come to the road that was considered a way forward. The road that he chose to take was coming to see what he thought God had been trying to teach Abraham all along. That life is gift. God in the Genesis story didn't want Isaac sacrificed. Wanted Abraham to be able to learn what is basic for all of life. We get so used to thinking that we earn everything. God, if I hear one more story about somebody pulling themselves up by their own bootstrap, I'm going to throw up. No, you didn't. If anybody here thinks that, no, you didn't. Infrastructure was built, schools were built, teachers were educated. The whole world's been put into place. We don't pull ourselves up for our own bootstrap. And that comes from somebody who was raised pretty poor, by the way. We get to thinking that we earn everything. And grace comes hard. Life is gift. It comes from God. It's not what we earn. I remember in college, my sister got hold of an electric typewriter. I'm not sure why. She felt like that was a luxury she could afford, because when she married her husband, Tommy, they didn't have much. But she bought her electric typewriter. And in those days, nobody even envisioned a computer. So late in my college career, I actually was trying to be a student, which kind of shocked everybody. And so she loaned me that electric typewriter, and it made life so much easier. Wow, it made things a lot easier. No telling how great I would be if I had a computer back then. I got through, and I took it with me to seminary, and then as I was finishing seminary, she was taking classes down at the University of Tennessee, and she needed her typewriter. And I got so frustrated. What do you mean you need your typewriter? I'm using this typewriter. You see, I'd gotten so used to using the typewriter, I forgot that it was a gift loaned to me to make my life easier. I hadn't pulled myself up to the bootstraps to deserve that typewriter. I just was using it along the way. That's how we get with so many things. We fail to see graces as gift, children as gifts. Children become, oftentimes in our minds, tasks to be done. Little people to be shaped. Those who would make us proud and feel better about ourselves. But they're gifts. Anybody who's ever been up on that mountain praying that you got to go down the mountain with the person that walked up the mountain with you. You know what it's like to walk down the mountain having left the gift at the top. And in our pain and in our grief and in our frustration and in our trying to figure things out and in our ways of trying to fix ourselves, we forget that he or she was a gift. God gave the gift. We can rant and we can rail, and we ought to. But at some point, we come to that place in our journeys where we rub our eyes and perhaps we learn what Abraham had to learn, and that was the miracle child was a gift at birth and was still a gift as he walked down the mountain with his dad. May God help us work our way through, no matter what solutions or understandings we come up with. May we always see those connected to us, walking with us in our journeys as a gift.